Thanks, everybody. Nice to meet you all. My name's Al, and I'm with a company called Play Bigger, and we design categories for our living. It's kind of what we do. And in the next 25 minutes, I'm going to explain category design to you, and I think you'll figure out that actually many of you are category designers as well. All right? So let's get started. And one of the things we've figured out over the last 2 or 3 decades of doing category design is that every product or service that we all love and use happens because a legendary entrepreneur, like the folks in the audience, had this idea for a great product, a great company, and a great category. They went about mindfully building and designing product, company, and category. And I'm going to start with a story about this fellow. Anybody know who this is? We've got one show of hands. His name's Clarence Birdseye. He's from the 1920s. He was quite an adventurous soul. And Clarence used to spend his summers in northern Canada. And in northern Canada, of course, it's cold, especially in winter, but in summer even. And he watched the native people, and what he would find was that they would fish, they'd bring the fish up, the fish would land on the ice, kind of flop around for a little bit, and then sort of freeze. And he had this insight, a founding insight is what we call it in our book called Play Bigger, that if you could flash freeze fish, you could probably do the same for other foods. And if you think about the 1920s, in America at that time, you know, there wasn't like daily flights coming in from the East Coast or the West Coast to deliver fresh food. The only really way you'd get fresh vegetables in particular was if you lived near a farm. So Clarence went about creating a new product. It was called flash freezing. And that would be normally where most innovators would stop and the story would end, hey, I developed this incredible thing called flash freezing. So the product design, he did a pretty good job of, but he actually had to then go and do something else. And you've probably already figured this out, that to get the frozen foods from the farm to the market required transportation. In the 20s, there were trains and a few automobiles. So he had to go out and create an ecosystem for his product to actually distribute it to the markets, which was the final destination where the consumer would make the purchase. And so he convinced all the railway cars to actually put frozen railway cars. But that wasn't enough either. Think about it. You sort of have flash frozen foods. They get frozen, taken by railway car. They've got to get shown somewhere. And of course, in the supermarkets, he had to convince them to put freezers in. So part of his company design and the go-to-market strategy was about actually building out an ecosystem of transportation and ultimately retail. And of course, we walk down the hall in our, if I could just push the right button here, we walk down the hall in our supermarkets today, and it's called the frozen food aisle, right? That's what it's called. Well, who created the frozen food category? Clarence, okay? So not only did he create a great product, flash freezing, not only did he have to build a great ecosystem to distribute this thing, he created a category which now is in the trillions of dollars in terms of the value of that category over that 100-year period. And that's what great entrepreneurs do. They don't stop at product, they don't stop at company, they go to what we call the third leg of the stool, which is category design. It's a new management discipline. It's something that we've been practicing for many years. You folks are probably already doing it anyhow. And the reason we know that is because as part of our book, we had a very big research agenda, and the research agenda took 2 different tracks. There was a sort of a quantitative agenda to understand how startups grow, what the time to market cap is, who ultimately creates the most value. That's on the left-hand track, and there's a recent study just published. And on the qualitative track, we interviewed about 100 of the greatest entrepreneurs of all time to understand what it was that they did beyond just their product and their company. And ultimately, we figured out that they did what we call category design, and you guys probably are doing it already. So let's talk about 4 insights that we figured out. The first one is, in our world, in the technology world, for the most part, every single category is a winner-take-all game. You might hear people say, well, you know, I'll be happy with second or third or fourth position, I'm here to tell you that you really don't want to be second, third, or fourth, because the leading company in a category will, for the most part and on average, take 76% of the market cap of the entire category. Right? So it's really important that you sort of understand that what you're playing for is 3/4 of the market cap for the entire category. And when you understand that, it changes the way you think about taking your product and company to market. And actually, we had a really fun article just recently with Susie Welsh. And she called us and said, hey, you know, we're doing this LinkedIn top 100 companies. And we said, sure, send us the list. And the first 7 companies on that list we had previously identified as a category king. So, you know, and that was about which companies attracted the most people. Turns out that the 7 most attractive companies, the places people want to work, turn out to be category kings. So in addition to the market cap stat, Susie introduced us to a new one, which is actually people want to work for category kings too. So it's a winner-take-all game. The second thing is, just like product and just like company have an evolution, so do categories. And it looks like this. The pink line shows sort of technology adoption. It starts out with the innovators and ultimately ends up into the large part of the marketplace. And there's a sort of a section in the middle which has really high growth, right? And the other graph that you need to understand, or the other line on that chart that you need to understand, is the dotted one, which actually shows the number of vendors in any one particular category at a particular point in time. And when the category first starts, you see the number of vendors fly off the hook, right? Who's seen this before? You know, a new category emerges, 27 companies show up, right? Everyone's seen this, right? And then what happens is, you know, the really good ones work on product, company, and ultimately category. And in this middle section, all of a sudden the number of vendors drops off and the category itself starts to explode. And if you do the math on that, you'll find that that's where the real value gets created. And the overlay that you're looking at is what we call the 610 law. If you look at the value created post-IPO by all the companies founded since 2000, what you see is that there's a very narrow band between 6 and 10 years where if you're in that band and you hit what we call the sweet spot, that's when you create all the long-term value. And in fact, we just published an update to this. It was such a lively conversation that this could possibly be true, that all the value is created by companies between 6 and 10 years. And so we went back and did a whole bunch more research on it. And what you're looking at is the latest study. It's available on playbigger.com. So the second thing is there's a category life cycle, there is a sweet spot, and there's a natural evolution of categories. The third thing is actually, having said all of that, categories themselves are not static. And put your hands up if you were around when the CRM category started to move. Anyone in this? Okay, there's quite a few people here, so you'll know this story. But in the early days of CRM, we had Rolodexes. They were physical things, cards in a file, and when I wanted to capture your information, I would write it on a card, slot it in, and if I wanted to call you, you might never believe this. A lot of the young people in the audience probably think I'm telling untruths here. But we would pick out the card, pick the phone off the wall, it was bolted to the wall, dial it, and call you. That was what customer relationship management was back then. The PCs came along, and you saw with product like Act and Goldmine, you had contact management software, which meant you put all of those contacts into your PC, and then you could dial them straight off of the computer screen. People then said, well, gee, if I'm talking to Jim, and I have a conversation with him, I may as well capture that and put it in the system. That became Salesforce automation. That category grew out of content management. And ultimately, Tom Siebel, anyone heard of Tom Siebel in this room? Good. He was the inventor of a category called CRM, Customer Relationship Management. He said it's not just about the outbound calls, it was also about, hey, field service call or a call center call. I need to capture that information, bring it all together. And then Tom made one flaw and one fatal mistake, which was he built his software on client-server architecture, which at the time seemed like a really good idea, except it was really difficult to implement. Anyone tried to implement a Siebel system in this room? Anyone actually implement it and get it running? Nobody. Okay, so that's the story, right? And of course, Benioff came in and said, actually, it's about no software. It's not about installing software. It's about this thing called the cloud. It was ASP at the time. and SaaS. And he invented this new category called cloud CRM. That's the big lift, and of course there's a whole set of companies, probably many in the room today, who are actually starting to really think about what the next sort of generation of CRM looks like. So these categories happen over a 10 to 15 year period, but they also take over from each other. So that's the third thing. And the fourth thing is that you're probably wondering, well, what is all this category BS anyhow? Where did it come from and what does it mean? And it turns out it's actually how our brains work. And so the reason it works is because it's the way our brains work. And that companies actually, and products for the most part, don't live in space. They actually live in a place in our heads, in a filing system. And if you can get into that filing system, you're going to win. And that place that you live is actually a thing called a category. And categories are the way that we all discover and relate to companies and to products. And I'll give you the visual example is, you've got a shopping list, you've got all these problems you've got to solve. I've got to cook pasta tonight, I need these ingredients, etc. You walk into a Whole Foods, who's had this experience? You stand there, it's like, holy smokes, like where on earth would all these things be? Turns out that for hundreds of years we've had this categorization scheme, and if you look above the aisle, what is it? A whole set of categories, right? You're immediately, oh yes, that's in the seafood aisle, or that's in the laundry aisle, whatever it might be. So that's how we think. And if someone said to you, hey, I got to get to Tahoe next weekend, it's really snowy, what sort of car do I get? You're probably going to say an SUV. Well, what's an SUV? It's a category. Of course it is. You didn't say it was a Porsche Cayenne or a Ford Explorer. You didn't go to the product or the brand or anything. You went straight to the category because that's the problem that you're trying to solve, and that's the way your head works. And so our brains are actually, they create these categories to cope with all of this mess. And if you think about the world that we live in today, these marketing platforms, again, many of you probably are already building these things, are targeting us and bombarding us. And I saw an article the other day that says we get thousands of marketing messages every day. So in a world where we're getting all of this stuff coming at you, it's even more important to have a filter system, and that filter system is called categories. And a number of researchers in brain science have actually told us that our brains naturally turn to filter all of this stuff. They turn to actual cognitive biases that don't work on logic. You don't sit there and look at every one of those things and do yeses and nos and all that sort of stuff. It's based on instinct. And there are 4 really important biases as a category designer that you need to understand. The first one is anchoring effect. If we're negotiating for a car price and you say, how about I give you $5,000? You've anchored the conversation at $5,000. It's not going to be 50 and it's not going to be 500. It's going to be somewhere around $5,000. You need to be the one who anchors the conversation around the problem. The second thing is groupthink. You see this on social media every time. If Fred likes it, so does Sally, because Sally and Fred are friends. There's choice supportive bias, and the idea of conformity are also important. And so category designers use these brain shortcuts to change the behavior, the usage, and the purchasing behavior of their customers, and ultimately drive that category curve. Okay, that's the theory. So here's a few hints. And if you read our book, Play Bigger, you'll see that there's a whole bunch of these hints laid out into a very formal methodology that you can all follow. And the first one is, talk about the problem. Talk about the problem and keep talking about the problem. Don't talk about the solution. Talk about the problem, because I have a problem. If you're talking to me about something that I feel about, then I understand. And generally, if you speak about the problem better than anybody else, you know what happens? I immediately think you have the answer. Who's had this experience? You go into a doctor's office, you got a sore knee, the guy or the girl says, well, yeah, that's the blah, 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 and do you have this? And yeah, that's all true. You immediately think, because they understand your problem, that they have a solution. It's just human psychology. And all categories, this is Anne Muraco. Anyone know who Anne Muraco is in the room? Quite a few people, yeah. She's from Floodgate, and she was one of our innovators and helped us with the book. And she says that all great companies have at a starting point this sort of notion of a market or a technology insight. That thing, that spark, that's the problem I'm going to spend the rest of my life solving. It's really important for humankind to solve this, and that's where they start from. Here's some famous category problems. I need to make a louder guitar. Who was that? Correct. I want to surf longer in cold water. Come on, someone said O'Neill over here, so on and so forth. And so these are the sort of the great category problems that have been solved by these wonderful category designers. Okay, hint number 2 is language matters. The way you speak, the words you use, and the sort of the way in which you present and frame the problem really does matter. And what happens is category designers use language to condition the market to adopt something new and different. I want you to stop for a second and think about last time you went into a supermarket and you were buying energy drinks. 10 years ago, was there a thing called energy drinks? No. Everyone's shaking their head, no. No, you're right. And guess what this is? Is this an energy drink? No, correct. It's an energy shot. And where is it sold? Whereabouts in the supermarket is it? Is it in the drinks aisle? No, it's not. Where is it? It's a checkout. It's a whole new category of things called energy shots, invented by one awesome entrepreneur. And here's the funniest story. The contents of that thing and the contents of the energy drink, how much overlap do you think there is? It's high. It's the same thing, it's in a different form factor. And you could have come out and said, well, I have a small energy drink, or I've got a better energy drink. Do you think that would have made any difference? No. He created a new thing, his point of view was, hey, just because I'm tired doesn't mean I'm thirsty. I don't want to have to drink a whole can of yuck just to get the juices flowing. I'm actually going to have this thing called an energy shot. It's the same thing with Starbucks. Brilliant use of energy. I'll have a triple non-fat latte, grande, extreme, mocha, what? That's all language. Who invented that? Starbucks. In the old days, you used to just go in and grab off the counter for 50 cents at the local diner a cup of coffee. Now you're paying $4.50 and waiting for 20 minutes, and you're happy about it. Why? Because someone invented a category, okay, and they created a new type of experience and a new type of language. That's what you have to do. And there's a difference between a sea panda and a killer whale. Which one do you want to be? Language matters, okay? Okay. So the third thing is, and this is really hard for engineers, and I'm an engineer, so I know how hard it is. Be different, not better. Many entrepreneurs, and we meet maybe 100 companies a year, come and say, hey, listen, I got the fastest, best carbidingulator in history, and when people find out about it, I'm going to make $1 billion. It's like, well, no, you're not. You know, have you heard of Betamax? And that was the best recording sort of technology. It didn't win. Marketing and positioning and communication, the way you define your category really matters. And actually, the master of master, even though he was geeky in product, was this guy called Steve Jobs. And for those of you who weren't there, I can recount this because I was. And this was when the iPad came out. At the time, I guess it was 7 years plus or minus before that, tablets emerged, and Microsoft announced this really cool thing. I think was the way that Gates actually presented this thing. Jobs did not do that. He put a phone up on this side, the iPhone. He put a laptop on this side, on both of these screens, and he said, people, I have a dilemma. When I'm watching movies, sitting on the couch, just wanting to cruise my social network and kind of just chill, that keyboard gets in the way. And the other problem I have is that the screen on my phone, even though I really like doing all of those things, is just too small. And it's not quite personal enough. I need something different. I need to solve a different problem. And he convinced us all that we had this problem, which was when we didn't want one of these or one of these, we had this. And he then said, and ta-da, we have this thing called the iPad, and what did we all do? We went out and bought them, right? And it's true. So he evangelized the problem, and then once he got you connected to his problem, he said, and ta-da, the answer is. And we all went out and bought them. Lyft is another great example, different. They just released a fantastic manifesto about the future of transportation. Has anyone read it? Has anyone read the Lyft? It's really fun, you should read it. It's a wonderful piece of communication by a great category designer. And he's really talking about the cars themselves are just the worst piece of investment that we could possibly make as a human race, and then we need to get rid of them. It's a car company. It's a taxi company. What are you talking about? You should read it. It's really fun. It's a really different way of thinking about it. Okay, number 4. We call them Frodos, from twos. And category designers are really not just responsible for their product, as you can see with Clarence Birdseye. They're really responsible about evangelizing a whole category and bringing an ecosystem behind them. And so talking about the from, no frozen foods. If you didn't live near a farm, you were taking vegetables out of a can, to a world where you just fired up the steamer and out came all of these fresh vegetables. And so your job, and here's a couple of examples. This is the old way of health insurance or health care, and this is the new way, right? So it's a from and a to. Contrasting the old to the new is really helpful. Another great example is Zuck put this up at one of the recent F8 conferences. He's talking about the future of communication. If you think about what he's doing, he's starting to condition your mind to move away from Facebook as a, quote, social network to Facebook as a communications company. That's what he's doing. So he's actually moving category from social network to communications. He had this great manifesto and talk about that the world was going to fundamentally change in the way we communicate, and Facebook's going to be at the center of that. Okay, hint number 5. It's a fun one. If you don't position yourself, I'll guarantee one thing. Someone else will. Okay? And so category designers, you basically have 2 choices. It's like, you can position yourself if you want, or someone else is going to do that. Anyone remember the Hangover movie? Just put your hands up if you've seen the Hangover movie. You remember this scene? Dude wakes up in the morning, he's got Mike Tyson's tattoo on his face. I hope you like Mike Tyson's tattoo, right? Because that's what happens. When people put a category on you, I hope you like that tattoo. If you want to be the one who puts a tattoo on, make sure it's one you actually want, not Mike Tyson's tattoo. So the question I ask all of you folks is, who controls your position? Did anyone have a guess? Who controls your position, people? Yes, you do. So you've all got a job to do. And finally, your category is not going to design itself. It's really up to you as entrepreneurs to take responsibility, not just product design, not just company design, but also category design. Thanks very much. You've been a great audience. Enjoy the book.